The Picture Man by John Dalmas. Knowing the immediate future could be very profitable if we could act upon such information, particularly if it was like tomorrow's newspaper available today. But there are problems and catches, and the human element cannot be ignored. I put down my copy of Ecological Review and walked over to the TV. I generally liked to catch the 10 o'clock news. The picture popped out to fill the screen. The last moment of the opening commercials was just flashing off. I sat back down to watch, all by myself in my 3-bedroom, 1.5 bath, near campus 1950 model house. It got a little lonely at times since Adie had Dear John'd me with Barney Foster, but it was certainly quieter and less irritating. For example, the house wasn't dominated night after night by game shows, situation comedies, and TV dramas. I'd learned the hard way that marrying the best-looking girl in the class and living happily ever after weren't necessarily the same thing. Several female faculty and staff members had demonstrated an interest in filling the presumptive hole in my life, and there had been some interesting evenings. Maggie Lanning in particular combined looks and physical interest with remarkable level-headedness in every area we'd talked about. Plus, she was willing to hike in the rain, played a great forward in couples basketball. She was an assistant professor in physical education and even had a collection of old John Campbell editorials cut from years of astoundings and analogues. Not that she was old. She was 33, 2 years younger than I. But marriage? We could already talk and romp at our mutual convenience, and she had one major drawback, 10-year-old Lanny. Lanny was a good kid, we got along fine, and he kept dropping hints that I'd make a good dad and Maggie would make a good wife. But he was going to be a teenager in less than 3 years, and I was still enjoying my new independence. I should, I decided, write a thank you note to Barney now that the divorce was final. I wouldn't, though. It would be a cheap shot, and I wouldn't feel good about it afterward. The weatherman joggled me out of my reverie with mention of a sunspot storm, so when the basketball and hockey scores were over, I put on a jacket and went to the door. Sunspots might mean an aurora display, and watching northern lights was one of my favorite spectator activities. If I'd turned on the porch light before I went out, I might not have seen what I did. A stocky, square-looking man was digging in my plastic trash can that sat by the curb waiting for morning pickup. 2 steps, and he could have been out of sight behind Chuck Cicconi's privet hedge. He dug into the armpit, setting some contents on the sidewalk for better access, straightened for a moment, then tidily put everything back in the can and replaced the lid, clamping it down. There hadn't been anything edible or valuable in the can. "Hey," I said. Slowly he looked toward me, then lowered his face and started to walk off. "Just a minute," I called. "Come on in. Do me a favor. Help me eat some leftovers." The dim face looked at me again for a few seconds. Then he walked toward the house, hands stuffed in the pocket of his denim work jacket. For a moment I had a feeling of strangeness as, hunched against the cold and night, he approached. Not a feeling of threat, just strangeness. The square, high-cheekboned face, grimy and stubbled, was lined with the track record of late middle age. He looked like someone who'd ridden into town on a freight train, probably headed south. I held the door for him. It was that, or wash the knob, and headed him for the bathroom. "Why don't you shower down while I cook?" I said, then pointed out the guest towel and washcloth and left him there. Being fresh out of leftovers, I put eggs and weenies on to boil, set a can of beans over a low flame, and put the tea kettle on for hot chocolate. When everything was underway, I resurrected an old pair of jeans and a baggy sweatshirt and put them on the bathroom rug. The place was full of steam, like a Turkish bath. He must have a remarkable tolerance for hot water, I thought. I announced to the shower that I was going to run his clothes through the washer and dryer, that I was leaving some of mine he could wear, and getting a faint acknowledgement, went and started the washing cycle. I even threw his black stocking cap in. I'd have to remember not to put it in the dryer. What in the hell, I asked myself, are you doing? This guy could be a psycho. He could murder and rob you, but there'd been nothing deadlier than a small jackknife in his pockets. On an impulse, and feeling uncomfortable about it, I checked his wallet. It had no money. A merchant mariner's certificate identified him as Jaakko Savimaki of Calumet, Michigan. Fireman, oiler, water tender. Dated 1951, 32 years back. The square face in the picture was a youthful version of my man's, the hair blonde and crew cut. His driver's license address was Ironwood, Michigan. I'd heard about the mines up there being shut down. Opening the bathroom door, I peered into the clouded interior. "You'll find a razor and shaving cream in the medicine cabinet," I said, and turned on the exhaust fan so he could find the mirror. When he came out, he looked a lot better, although on him, my jeans were a couple of inches too long and a couple too tight. He'd made do by folding cuffs into them, leaving the waistband open and keeping them up with the elastic belt. "My name's Terry," I said. "Terry O'Brien." "Mine is Jake," he answered. "Jake Hill." Even in those few words, I detected an accent. "Mr. Hill, I took the liberty of looking in your billfold for identification. It said your name is Savimaki." He didn't blush or look angry or embarrassed. The strange, soft blue eyes just gazed at me, as if examining the inside of my head. "Savimaki is a kind of hill in Finnish," he said. "Away from home, it's easier to just tell people hill." I nodded. "Got it," I said. "All right, Mr. Savimaki, supper is on the counter." As hungry as he must have been, he didn't bolt his food. When he'd finished, he thanked me and took his dishes to the sink before I realized what he was doing. Then he turned to me, and again his eyes were direct. I got the feeling that he saw more than other people did. "How do I pay you back?" he asked. "Forget it. It's on me." He didn't shake his head, simply said, "It's not all right for me to take something for nothing." Well, I thought, that's a refreshing viewpoint. I wasn't sure I totally agreed with it, in a country where the system was so screwed up that some people found themselves backed up against the wall. But if everyone had his attitude, things would be a lot better. "Okay," I said. "What do you do?" The pale eyes shifted to the fireplace. "You got any wood to split?" "No, sorry. I buy it already split." "Any carpentry you need done? Windows fixed? Locks repaired?" I looked at the possibilities. "You hit me at a bad time. I've got nothing like that. Why don't we defer payment? There'll be snow to shovel a little later in the fall." His eyes withdrew for a moment. He didn't plan to be around Douglas long. "Tell you what," I suggested. "Why don't you pass it on? Help someone else out when you have a chance." He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "I guess that's okay." Then he turned to the sink and began to run water for the dishes while I transferred his clothes to the dryer, remembering to hold out his stocking cap. He seemed to think slowly, but he washed dishes fast. They were clean, rinsed, and in the drainer in about 2 minutes. When he was done, he followed me into the living room and stood uncomfortably. I could see he still wasn't happy about not exchanging anything for the bath, meal, and laundry. Then he noticed the pictures on my wall, mostly wildland photos. When Adie had taken her prints from the house, I'd mounted some scenic photographs on mat and hung them to handle the bareness. He walked over and looked at them. "You got a camera?" he asked. 3 of them, a 35mm Pentax for slides, an old Rolly 4x5, and a Polaroid 680. "A Polaroid?" He considered that for a moment. "How would you like if I gave you some interesting pictures?" "What do you mean?" "Let me show you. Get the Polaroid." Feeling mystified, I got it reluctantly. When I came back to the living room, he was sitting in a chair. "Is it loaded?" he asked. "Always," I said. "Then aim it at my face." He closed his eyes tightly, his brow clenched with concentration. "When I say now, shoot it." Feeling foolish, I raised the camera. "Now," he said. I touched the shutter release, lowered the camera, and waited. He was on his feet beside me when I removed the print. It wasn't a picture of Savimaki. It was a house, somewhat blurred, an old frame 2-story house with a steep roof, no front porch, and an upstairs door that opened out onto thin air. A ladder was built on the wall up to the strangely placed door. "Let's do another one," he said. "That one ain't very good. I can get something more interesting than that." "Wait a minute," I said. "How come it isn't a picture of you?" Actually, I thought I knew why. Years before, I'd read a book about the detailed, if somewhat ambiguous, studies done on Nick Kopak, the psychic photographer. This looked like the same kind of thing. "I don't know," he said. "It's just something I can do." Strange-looking house. Where is it? In Calumet, Michigan. It's the house I grew up in. It looks like that because they get so much snow there. Some winters you get in and out through the upstairs door. My God! And didn't you know that's what the picture was going to be of? "No, I haven't learned how to know yet." He sat down again. "Usually I get something I never even seen before, but it's always a house or a ship, so far. Actually, I only ever did this about 10 or 12 times before. I found out about it last winter by accident, when a guy tried to take a picture of me and I didn't know it. I was reading a magazine, and all he got was a picture of a lighthouse." "Are you ready now?" he asked. I nodded. "Yep." He closed his eyes, I aimed, he said "now" again, and I shot. Together we looked at the print. This one was sharper, hardly blurred at all, showing a square house that looked stuccoed. It reminded me of pictures I'd seen of French farmhouses, but in the background was a broadly naked landscape with what looked like a high, cliff-faced plateau behind it. As an ecologist with a strong interest in biogeography, I was willing to bet it was an Afrikaner farmstead in South Africa, and told him so. He shrugged. "Could be." We took a couple more, then called it quits, and I showed him the guest bedroom. But my mind was racing. I didn't have a class the next day until 2 in the afternoon, and I could always cancel my morning office hours, although I didn't like to. I thought I knew where I could get Jake a job. After he sat down, I went to the phone and called Herb Bolts. I didn't actually know Bolts very well, although as well as I wanted to. We were both in the faculty jogging club. He was a faculty politician, if you know what I mean, reputedly handy with a knife to the back, a full professor in psychology at 32, and a man who always seemed to have access to grant money. And he was said to be interested in parapsychology. It was 11:15, and apparently I had wakened him. He didn't sound terribly friendly, so as soon as I'd identified myself, I put it to him this way. "I think I've got something that can get you a lot of good publicity. Remember the studies on psychic photography at the University of Nebraska? That's right, Nick Kopak. Well, I've got a guy staying here at my house that does the same sort of thing. I took 4 shots with my Polaroid, got 2 houses, a church, and what looks like a commercial fishing boat. No, I just met him today. Seems like a good enough guy, kind of quiet. He needs a job, and I knew, or at least I heard, that you had some grant money that might be available. It looks like a good opportunity for research with some media appeal, if it's handled right." When I hung up, we had an appointment for 11 the next morning. At 11:07 we walked into the education building, which also houses the psych department. I prefer to be on time, but Heron's men's wear doesn't open until 10, and we needed some presentable but inexpensive clothes for Jake. Slacks, a shirt, shoes, sweater, jacket. Actually, on my salary there isn't such a thing as inexpensive clothes. Some just cost less. The meeting wasn't long. Bolts admitted to $800 in an account for exploratory research, which these days suggests he had something on someone. It wasn't enough to put Jake on the payroll. He agreed to pay him a $10 allowance for cigarettes and socks, as he put it. Jake was to stay with me, and Bolts would pay me $30 a week toward his room and board for any week in which Jake's services were used, plus $10 for each additional session, which we could split as we saw fit. I was also to transport Jake to and from local sessions, as the studies would be done at Bolts's home on the other side of town, starting that evening at 7:30. Bolts had a bad reputation, so I wrote it all down, and the three of us signed it, and afterward I got it photocopied. I was surprised that my wanting it in writing didn't annoy Bolts, but he was genial and cheerful throughout. I told myself he ought to be. He was getting a very promising research project, journal articles, personal publicity, and speaking engagements, all at damned little expense. And none of the expense was his personally. I, on the other hand, would be an unpaid cook and chauffeur, but it did promise to be damned interesting. We hurried home, I grabbed a quick snack, and left Jake there while I rushed off to handle the Thursday afternoon lab in Plant Science 101. It occurred to me that it wasn't ideal leaving a stranger alone in my home while I went off to work, but somehow I didn't feel concerned. I took time to phone Maggie that afternoon. I needed someone to tell all this to, and she was the closest thing I had to a confidant. She said she'd be at my place about 5:30 to meet Jake and fix us supper. She sounded almost too cheerful to be real. Then I phoned home. Jake sounded sober and had started reading Churchill's memoirs. I told him Maggie would be coming by to fix supper and might get there before I did. She drove up just as I was opening the garage door, and we went in together, to find supper on the table. Jake had hunted through refrigerator and cupboard and had fixed pork chops, rice, sweet potatoes and cornbread. He'd walked to the store and bought the cornmeal out of a 5 I'd loaned him. When I came out of shock, I introduced him to Maggie. "Hyvää iltaa, Mr. Savimäki," she said, grinning. I stared at her. "Hyvää iltaa, Ruva." "Lanning," he said back. "Mitä kuuluu?" She laughed. "I just used up all the Finnish I remember. When Terry told me your name, I thought, Hail, that sounds like home. I'm from Duluth." "So that's where you learned to say Hyvää iltaa?" "Right. My mom is Finnish-American, but my dad wasn't, so I didn't learn much at home. I learned more from the neighbors." She turned to me. "What a treat this is going to be." She gestured at the table. If I'd fixed it, we'd be having hot dogs and beans. I knew better than that. After supper, when Jake insisted on washing the dishes, I decided this arrangement was going to be a lot better than I'd thought. And after I took Jake to Boltz's, I could hurry back to spend an hour or two alone with Maggie. But that wasn't the way it worked, because Maggie wanted to go along and stay to watch. That was fine with Bolts. He liked to play to an audience. He had his own Polaroid, new that day, and took quite a few exposures. The first couple were whiteys, no picture, not even of Jake. They looked as if they'd been shot into a flood lamp, which was remarkable enough in itself. The third was a blackie. It was as if it hadn't been exposed at all. But Bolts and I were prepared for that. According to the literature, Kopak used to get whiteys and blackies a lot. Bolts looked at Jake, then, with this knowing smile, went over to a cabinet and poured a whole glass of bourbon. "Would you like a drink, Jake?" he asked. But how it came across was, "Kay, you cunning boy, I know why you're holding out on me." It irritated me. I felt insulted for Jake. But whether the whiskey had anything to do with it or not, the next picture was of the Taj Mahal, sharp and clear. Then Jake threw down the whiskey like ginger ale. The next was of a Hilton hotel somewhere. Without saying anything, Bolts nudged me and pointed at a part of the picture. On the sign, the name Hilton was spelled wrong. "Jacob," said Bolts, "how do you spell the name Hilton?" Jake's quiet eyes fixed on Bolts. "Hilten," he answered. What in the hell, I thought to myself, does this mean? By the time we left at 8:30, Bolts had poured a second glass of whiskey down Jake and had half a dozen pretty fair shots, 4 of them buildings, 1 a pyramid buried in tropical jungle, and 1 of a 3-masted schooner in a storm. Jake didn't even seem a little tight when we walked out, although he wasn't saying much. I decided he must have a thing for booze in his generation. That was apparently why most drifters became drifters, although it might have been the other way around. And Bolts was using it as a way to keep Jake around and performing. That was how it looked. When we got home, I asked Jake how the evening had been for him. His answer was concise and unambiguous. "I don't like Professor Bolts," he said. He also said he was tired and went to get ready for bed. Maggie and I watched television until he retired, then moved together on the sofa. There were 3 more sessions scattered over the next 10 days, semi-public in that Bolts invited several other faculty members and B. Lundeen to them. B. was the owner-editor of the local paper, the Douglas Clarion. As chauffeur, I was welcome to sit in too. It was interesting as hell, although Bolts didn't try anything that hadn't been tried 15 years earlier with Nick Kopak. Under his direction, Jake found he could do things he hadn't tried before. To start with, all he got were seemingly random shots of buildings and ships, pretty much like Kopak had gotten, almost nothing but buildings and statues. But Jake had a lot better batting average. He got a picture about 2 times out of 3, and most of them pretty clear. Frankly, I was surprised he did that well, because Bolts was really unpleasant to work for. He continued to use booze in a very obvious way as a carrot on a stick, but I noticed that Jake never asked for it. He didn't even say yes when Bolts asked if he wanted some. He just accepted it when Bolts handed it to him. He certainly knew what to do with it then, though. Another thing Bolts did was to talk to Jake as if he were some kind of retard. "Now, Jacob, I'm going to ask you to make us a picture of a cathedral. Can you do that for us? Let's try. Do you know what a cathedral is? Good. Very, very good. And, oh, that's good, Jacob. You're doing very, very well tonight." Maybe that's why Jake kept accepting the whiskey. Not really, though, because I'd swear I saw a sort of amusement in those pale eyes. Maybe he enjoyed seeing Bolts unwittingly irritate everyone around him and in general make an ass of himself. The article B wrote for the Clarion was all about Jake. Bolts was mentioned only once. Then there was a lapse of a few days before the 5th session, which was a big one, a Saturday night affair. We'd been written up far beyond the Clarion by then, and interest was spreading. More people had been invited than there was room for at Bolts's, and it was held in the home of Professor Tony Fornés, chairman of the physics department. Fornés was wealthy, had a big house outside town, was cautiously interested in the project and made for good positioning. Physics had a lot more status than psychology. Everyone who'd been invited was there, and relatively on time. No one was more than 20 minutes late, even though the streets were snow-packed and slippery, and the temperature was about 10 degrees. Professor Alfred Kingsley Kenmore had flown in from Virginia, the Kenmore of Hertz Kenmore Laubman clairvoyance studies fame, and Marty Martin, the award-winning science writer from the Tribune. Maggie went with us. It started out like a circus, or at least a drawing-room comedy. Fornés announced that his assistant was going to film the whole procedure and had a 16mm movie camera at one side of the room on a high tripod to shoot down at Jake over people's heads. The film would later be examined in slow motion for any sign of hokey-pokey. Then Martin announced that he was going to match every shot of Boltz's with his own camera and film to provide a second, independent print. Finally, when Boltz was ready to begin, Kenmore, who was a psychiatrist and therefore an MD, had Jake lie down and examined his eyes, pulling out the upper and lower lids, peering under them with a little light. I haven't the slightest what he was looking for. Then we got started. Boltz was on his good behavior for a change. He didn't put Jake down, and no booze was in evidence, confirming that his previous bullshit was deliberate. He warmed Jake up by letting him do whatever he came up with. He started with an oblique aerial view of a beautiful landscaped home, with cities spread out in the mid-ground against a backdrop of mountains. Not Denver, I decided. Maybe Calgary. The next looked like Hong Kong. The third was a double row of tar-papered shacks with deep snow piled all around and forest close behind. A guy wearing what looked like a leather apron was caught in mid-stride between two of them. When it was shown to Jake, he identified it as the Axelson-Peltonen logging camp in Baraga County, Michigan, about 1948. He'd worked there. The guy in the apron, he said, was Ole Hovd, the blacksmith. I could tell that Jake was really pleased with that one, and I got a notion that just maybe he'd gotten it deliberately. Boltz didn't take any of the pictures himself. Each of them was taken by a different person standing directly in front of Jake and about 6 feet away. The camera had been bought new by Fournay. The film packs were taken from their sealed wrappers right there in front of us. Each shot was passed around before the next was taken. Then it was laid on a table, available for further examination. Martin was off to one side with his camera and didn't pass his shots around, but after the third, he arranged them on the table with Boltz's, making matched pairs. Boltz beamed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we have something very interesting here. Mr. Martin's photographs. Come and see." I was already there. In each instance, Martin's picture was of the same scene, but as if seen from an angle of about 90 degrees to the right, higher and farther away. Everyone crowded around talking, except Fournay's assistant, who stayed by his camera. A couple of them shook Jake's hand as he came over to look. The way the pictures matched up, it was as if the actual scene, the physical scene of each pair, had occupied the location of Jake's chair in 3 dimensions, and it was something that hadn't come up in the work with Nick Kopacz. Boltz was ready now to attempt something he'd tried with equivocal results the 2 sessions just previous. He had Bay Lundin and me go into Fournay's library to find a picture of a building or ship, any building or ship in the encyclopedia. Maggie went with us. B pulled out volume 14 KI to LE and turned to Kremlin, and there was the great Russian fortress looming above Red Square, the towers of its buildings showing above the massive wall. I nodded. We all looked at it, concentrating, and B called out, "Okay, we got one." Nothing more happened for about half a minute, and I got pretty fidgety, but we all kept looking at the picture. Then someone called, "Come on out. It's done." We did. B took the encyclopedia to the table and laid it down open, weighting it with an ashtray. Boltz removed his print, marked it with black grease pencil, and laid it down next to the book. What was there made my scalp crawl? Jake had given us the Kremlin all right, but not at all like the picture in the book. There was no broad paved parade ground. Instead, small log buildings were backed up against the fortress wall. The ground was mud, with logs laid in it as a sort of rude and partial paving. There were rows of market booths, and hundreds of people stood or walked around, some mostly naked, a few wearing long coats. It was a photograph of the Kremlin centuries ago, a photograph of life, not of a painting. There were some brief, quiet comments, but actually not much was said as people crowded up to look. Everyone seemed to realize the basic significance of it. Jake Savimaki could give pictures from the past, from before photography. This was not a picture of a photograph or thing he'd seen. We were in the presence of something much further beyond the limits of known science than we'd realized, a whole dimension further. Martin crowded his way to the table and looked without comment, then silently laid his own print beside the other. Again, it showed the same scene from maybe twice as far away. And here the apparent elevation was conspicuous. Boltz's shot might have been taken from 40 or 50 feet above the ground. Martin's was an oblique aerial shot, as if from a low-flying airplane. Except, of course, it wasn't. Jake had come quietly over, and now he took a look. His eyes didn't change. People looked at him, and he didn't seem to notice. It was as if he'd just dropped in and wanted to see what was going on. My eyes found Boltz. He was murmuring something quietly to Fournaise. Fournaise then called a break. In a minute or so, their cook appeared with hors d'oeuvres, and the lid was removed from the punch bowl. Something for people to handle without getting tight. Almost everyone soon had a glass in their hand, except Jake. He stood apart, watching the effects he'd caused, and caught my glance with a smile and a nod. Fournaise and Boltz talked quietly in a corner, then Martin joined them, and Kenmore. I started over to join them too, but some out-of-towner stopped me and asked if I hadn't come in with Mr. Savimaki. By the time I was free, the four of them had left the room. I felt a hand on my arm, and it was Maggie. "What does he do for an encore?" she asked. "God knows," I said. "Or the devil," I added silently. But that was unfair. If anyone around here had a devil, it was Boltz, not Jake. Jake was as clean as anyone. We went over to him. "Kinka simene, Mr. Savimaki?" Maggie asked him. He grinned. "Pretty good, Lito. How about you?" "I'm impressed," she said. "Do you know how you did that?" "Not exactly," he told her. "I just kind of opened myself up. I still don't know what a picture's going to be, but this time I decided I wanted something that would startle people." "You want to do any more tonight?" I asked him. "Or are you tired? We can go home if you'd like." "No, I feel real good. This gets easier every session. I'd like to see what else I can do. Those last pictures look like something from the past. Maybe I can get something from the future next." I felt my gut give a little twist. "You know what?" he went on. "I never felt this good before. In my whole life, and most of it ain't been bad." He put his full attention on me then and called me by my first name for the first time. "Terry, I never thanked you for calling me in that night. I'd hit bottom and you pulled me back up. I want you to know I appreciate it." He held out a hand big enough for an NFL tackle, and we shook. Then he turned to Maggie with a big grin, and she grinned back, and they shook too. We were interrupted. Boltz, Fournaise, Martin, and Kenmore had come back in, Boltz practically rubbing his hands in anticipation. "Excuse me, everyone, if you please," he called, and conversation stopped. "We'd like to continue now." People quieted down and shuffled themselves into a loose circle. "Do you need to warm up with something easy, Mr. Savimaki?" Boltz asked. Courtesy yet. It was the first time he'd called him Mr. Savimaki, but his eager eyes were like ice picks. Jake shook his head and said he was ready. Fournaise had his wife take over Martin's camera, and he, Boltz, and Martin left for the library. Kenmore picked up Boltz's camera and positioned himself in front of a slightly smiling Jake. It was a couple of minutes before we heard a voice call, "All right, we've got one." Jake closed his eyes. No longer was there any effortful concentration, no tightly shut lids. He looked relaxed and confident. "Now," he said. Kenmore clicked his shutter, and so did Liz Fournaise, and someone went to get the three from the library. Martin came in with a large book and laid it open on the table. I looked at it while Liz and Kenmore brought their prints over. It wasn't an encyclopedia, but a book entitled Weapons in the Sky, Military Applications of Space Technology. The chapter it was open to was Soviet programs. There wasn't even a picture on the page. Jake had outsmarted them, though. I didn't realize it at the time, but he had. Kenmore laid down his photo, and it was not of some satellite or anything like that. Instead, I saw a car, unidentifiable to me in the darkness, lying on its top in the snow. Liz's photo was the same, from another angle. In hers, I could see a body pinned underneath. That was the end of the performance. While people donned coats and caps, I took Bolts aside and collected. He didn't even look irritated with me. Not there would describe him. Then pulled on his gloves and left. On the way home, nobody talked for the first mile. "Whose car do you suppose that was?" I said at last. "I don't know," Jake answered. "I just know I didn't want to show them what they wanted, so I just decided to do a picture from the future. And that's what I got." No one followed up on that until we got home. When we'd hung up our coats and sat down, Maggie decided she needed to know. "Jake," she asked, "could you have shown them what they wanted?" His eyes were sober. "Get your camera," he told me. The first picture was of an orbiting space station, like nothing yet built, I'm sure. It was hard to judge size and distance, with nothing familiar as a reference, but it might have been 100 feet in diameter, bright against black space, from a viewpoint of maybe 100 yards away, a red hammer and sickle vivid on its side. "Holy God," I said. A whole panorama of potential events began to shape up for me. The CIA moving in, Jake held in some secluded place doing God knows what kind of spying for them, and Bolts, of course, handling Jake. Bolts would love it. How important he'd feel. "Take another one," Jake said. "I can see this one too." So he was seeing them in advance now. I aimed, he said, "Now," and I shot. It showed Jake strapped down on something like an operating table. He didn't even take the trouble to look at the photo. Maggie's hand found mine. "You see why I did it," he said, and we both nodded. The first thing I saw in the Clarion the next morning, right on the front page, was a picture of an overturned car. I'd seen one like it the night before. It was B. Lundine's. Kenmore and Martin had been with her, and Kenmore was dead. There was nothing in either the Clarion or the Trib about the session that day or any other. It was as if they were afraid of it, pushing it out of sight, out of mind, unable to confront what was there. We didn't hear anything from Bolts either on Sunday, or on Monday, or for most of the week. Meanwhile, Jake got a job cooking at the Douglas Hotel. He also arranged to move into a room there, but for some reason I talked him out of it. On Monday evening, Maggie came by with her mother, Anna Lati, who'd driven down from Minnesota to stay a week. She was a good-looking woman, about 50 or 55, and she and Jake hit it off right away, talking Finnish. She turned to us and laughed. Said she knew he was from Savo as soon as he opened his mouth because he rolled his R's. As if she didn't. When they talked Finnish, it sounded like two chainsaws. It was Friday when Bolts phoned. He wanted Jake again in half an hour, said I wouldn't need to bring him, that he'd come by and pick him up. I told him he'd have to talk to Jake and put my hand over the mouthpiece, remembering the picture of Jake strapped down. "It's Bolts," I said. "He wants to come and get you in half an hour for another session. He obviously doesn't want me to be there. I don't trust him. Tell him to go to hell." He smiled and took the phone. "Hello, Doctor Bolts," he said. "I'm busy tonight, but if you want to make that for tomorrow evening at 8, that will be fine." "At 8 then. I'll be ready." He hung up. "Jake," I said, and he grinned. His eyes weren't soft anymore. They looked darker and bright. "It's okay," he said. "And what you're worried about, It's not going to happen. Something's fishy with him, I insisted. He's hiding something, or I'm not Irish. He nodded. It's nothing to worry about, though. Do you know that? I asked. Do you know what he has in mind? I don't know what he has in mind, but it's not dangerous. Not to me. He grinned again then. And you told me you're only half Irish. The other half is Dutch. And you're half Swede, I said, trying to insult him. He just laughed. Maybe I should have said Russian. Then Anna Lati drove up. They had a date for supper and an evening at the ice rink. I watched them drive away. It looked like a romance in the bud. I hoped nothing bad would happen the next evening. The next night, Bolts was there 5 minutes early. After he and Jake drove away, I put on my jacket and cap, got in my car, and headed after them for Bolts's place. I parked half a block away, then chickened out. I couldn't think of any excuse for going up and pounding on his door, and I didn't want to get arrested for window peeking. So I got the Black Hawks pre-game show on the radio and waited. At 2 minutes into the first period, Marcel Dion scored on a breakaway. A couple of minutes later, Jake walked out of Bolts's and started down the sidewalk. I rolled down the window as he approached. Want a ride? He grinned and got in. Care to tell me what happened? Nothing much, he said. We talked a little bit, but you don't have to worry about my going back. Yeah? I said encouragingly. Yeah, he answered cheerfully. I started the car and pulled away from the curb. Yeah, what? I demanded. He laughed. He wanted me to make a picture showing someone dead. His father. He said the old man is dying slowly of an incurable cancer, in terrible pain, and that he'd be grateful to die. He thought if I made a picture of it, it would happen. I asked him what his father did for a living, and he said he'd been a banker. You can see what he's after. So you told him to go to hell? No, I told him I'd see what I could do. I almost drove up over the curb. You what? Then I gave him a picture of his father as he was at that moment, playing golf. Jake laughed again. There were palm trees in the background. Hawaii, I suppose. It's daylight there now. What did he say to that? He got all excited, said I'd made a mistake and got something from a year or two ago. It was 6 minutes into the first period. Esposito stopped a Mark Hardy slap shot and fell on Dave Taylor's rebound. Charlie Simmer fell on top of Esposito. Hutchinson shoved Simmer. Are you sure it wasn't the past? I asked. Positive. Then what happened? I told him I'd try once more. He wasn't smiling now. Maybe went a little bit too far then. What do you mean? Pull over and I'll show you. He opened his jacket while I pulled off on the shoulder, tires crunching on frozen slush, and handed me a Polaroid color print. There was Herb Bolts in a coffin. He didn't look a day older than he had that night at 8 o'clock. God, I said, you wished him dead? He shook his head. I wouldn't do a thing like that, he said soberly. I just decided to show him a picture of himself dead. I never thought about it looking like it could be next week or something. I just wanted to see how he liked it with the shoe on his own foot. He turned white as a sheet and just kind of fell on the chair. He sat there staring at nothing and never said another thing. Do you think it'll come true? This picture? I asked. I don't know, Jake said. I don't think so, but I'm not sure. I shifted back into drive again and pulled onto the pavement, half my attention on driving and the other half on the power of suggestion. Bolts seemed susceptible. He had at least half convinced himself that Jake could control, as well as predict, the future. It turned out that Jake's pictures do not fix the form of the future, or even necessarily predict it closely, though we learned later that they tended to be quite accurate. But the picture he showed me wasn't correct, any more than Hilton has an E in it, because the coffin was covered. About 4 o'clock the next morning, Herb Bolts put a .38 pistol barrel in his mouth and pulled the trigger, and there wasn't much the mortician could do to make him presentable. Jake got a room in the hotel after all. He said he'd been cramping my style, but maybe I'd been cramping his. He remained as cheerful and friendly as ever. Anna Lati went back to Duluth, put her property up for sale, and moved down, taking an apartment in the same building as Maggie lived in. A couple of months later, she and Jake got married. Maggie and I took a bunch of wedding pictures, and all they showed were Jake and Anna. I mentioned that to Jake jokingly, and he said he wasn't doing pictures these days. They really are a nice couple, and we went out with them fairly often, despite the age difference. Mostly to dance halls or the ice rink. I even learned to skate, though nowhere nearly as well as all three of them did. With their example, Maggie and I decided to tie the knot too. So Lanny was only 2.5 years short of his teens. I'd been a teenager once myself. And frankly, he was more likable than I'd been. Jake took a bunch of wedding pictures. He had a brand new Polaroid 680. I couldn't help but wonder. That summer they bought a restaurant and fixed it up really nicely with a Scandinavian motif, bringing a Swede down from Duluth to help with the cuisine. I figured Anna must have had a lot of money, but Maggie said not so far as she'd even known. Then one day they asked if we'd like to go to the races that weekend. I suppose they meant at Roxton Downs, only 50 miles away, but instead we flew to Maryland, and Jake bought the tickets and rented a car there. I bet on the same horses he did, and talk about a kick in the tax bracket. We had nothing but winners. A lot of things became clear to me then. It felt like strange money to me, but the bank was happy with it. Last evening we celebrated the anniversary of Jake's and my meeting. At their place, a little farm they'd bought just outside town. They'd fixed it up really nicely. When we got there, I noticed a big book on the table, a folio-sized book on astronomy for the informed layman. Beside it was a brand new video camera. He told me he had an interesting project going and asked if we'd care to take a little tour.